A widow finds her late husband's diary, but what she reads inside shakes her to the core. Emily sat at the small, antique desk in her living room, her hands resting on a cold cup of tea. It had been 2 years since James had passed, but to her, it felt like yesterday. The world around her seemed to have moved on effortlessly, as if the life she had shared with him was nothing more than a forgotten dream. For Emily, however, time had slowed, its rhythm dulled by the constant ache of loss. She was a woman in her late 40s, well off by most people's standards. From the outside, her life seemed comfortable. She lived in the same house she and James had bought a decade earlier, a large brick home nestled in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. Her friends often remarked on her grace and strength in the face of tragedy, but inside, Emily felt hollow. Her days unfolded like a rehearsed routine, as if she were simply acting the part of someone living a normal life. Every morning, she woke early, the house still and silent. She dressed with care, brushing her shoulder-length brown hair with mechanical precision, as if these small rituals would ward off the tidal wave of grief that constantly threatened to overwhelm her. Emily's wardrobe was filled with modest, well-kept clothes, nothing too vibrant, nothing that drew too much attention. She had always favored neutral tones, but after James's passing, her attire had become an extension of her mood. Shades of gray, beige, and navy blue mirrored the emptiness she carried within. Emily spent her days in a series of obligations that kept her body moving but left her heart untouched. She volunteered at the community center twice a week, organizing charity events and delivering meals to elderly neighbors. Her friends from the church often invited her to luncheons and book clubs, trying to fill her time with companionship and activity, but none of it brought her any real joy. The laughter of others, the meaningless chatter, it all felt like noise, a distant echo in a life that had lost its purpose. She would smile politely, nod at the appropriate moments, but her thoughts were always elsewhere. The house was the worst part. It was too big for one person, too filled with memories. Every room held traces of James. The scent of his aftershave still lingered faintly in the master bedroom, his old leather chair sat unused in the study, and his favorite mug remained tucked in the kitchen cabinet, untouched. Their wedding photo hung over the fireplace, a snapshot of a time when life felt certain, when she had believed in forever. But forever, it seemed, had been nothing more than an illusion. Emily had considered moving, selling the house, and starting fresh somewhere else, but the thought terrified her. It felt like giving up the last piece of him she had left. At night, when the world grew quiet and the darkness crept in, that's when her mind would wander. She would sit on the edge of the bed, staring out of the window into the blackness, wondering. She wondered if James had known how much she loved him, if she had been enough, if she had missed something, some sign that he wasn't well. The doctors had called it sudden, a heart attack, completely unexpected. There had been no time for goodbyes, no warnings. One moment, they were having dinner, talking about a trip they had planned to the coast, and the next he was gone. But as the weeks turned into months, and then into years, Emily found herself questioning more than just the circumstances of James's death. She began questioning their life together. Had she truly known him? She had thought she did, of course. After 20 years of marriage, how could she not? But now, looking back, she couldn't help but feel that there had been things left unsaid between them, shadows in their life that she had been too blind to see at the time. He had been a loving husband, kind and considerate, but he had also been private, guarded in a way she hadn't fully understood until now. There were moments, fleeting as they were, when she had felt like he was holding something back, but she had always brushed it off, assuming it was just her imagination. Her regret gnawed at her, a constant companion in her grief. She regretted not asking more questions, not digging deeper when she sensed something was wrong. She regretted the fights they had over trivial things, who forgot to take out the trash, who left the lights on in the kitchen. Looking back, all of it seemed so insignificant. Yet in those moments, she had let her frustration build. She regretted not telling him every day how much he meant to her, how much she appreciated his steady presence, his quiet strength. And now it was too late. Too late to ask, too late to say anything that mattered. The emotional conflict churned within her, a storm she couldn't escape. How could she move on when she wasn't even sure she understood the life she had shared with him? She knew her friends meant well when they encouraged her to find closure, to begin the process of healing, but they didn't understand.
How could they?
To them, James was just a memory, a man they had known only in passing. To Emily, he was her entire world, and that world had been ripped away, leaving her adrift, unsure of who she was without him. Emily's house had become a mausoleum of sorts, filled with the ghosts of the past. Every corner of it was imbued with his presence, from the bookshelf in the living room to the old records they used to play on Sunday mornings. His office, though, was the most haunting of all. She hadn't touched it since his death. The door remained closed, as if opening it would somehow release the weight of the grief she had buried deep inside. James had always been meticulous about his office, keeping it organized, almost sterile. It had been his space, a place where he would retreat after long days of work, writing in his journal or reading. Emily had respected that, never intruding on his quiet moments there. But now, that room stood like a silent monument to everything that had gone unsaid between them. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next. Emily tried to distract herself, keeping busy with the small, mundane tasks that filled her time, but nothing could shake the emptiness that gnawed at her soul. She lived in a comfortable prison, a life surrounded by the echoes of the past, where every object, every memory, reminded her of what she had lost. And no matter how much she tried to suppress it, the questions lingered. Who had James been, really? Had she truly known the man she had loved? Or was there more to his story, something buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered? Emily had always found solace in the park near her home. The gentle sway of the trees, the sound of water trickling from the small fountain in the center, and the soft hum of distant traffic created a quiet sanctuary from the heaviness of her home. Today was no different. She had taken her usual walk, her footsteps steady, but devoid of purpose. The crisp air of early autumn wrapped around her, and the leaves, turning gold and red, fell silently to the ground, like the passing of time she could neither stop nor control. As she walked past the old stone benches that lined the fountain's edge, something caught her attention, a figure sitting alone. It wasn't uncommon to see people at the park, enjoying the serenity just as she did, but this young woman seemed different. Her posture was hunched, her head bent low, as if she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. Emily hesitated, her natural instinct to avoid intrusions kicking in, but something about the woman's stillness drew her in. She approached slowly, her steps cautious, not wanting to startle the stranger. As she neared the fountain, she could see the woman more clearly. She couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail, and her face was pale, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. She sat there, unmoving, her eyes fixed on the water as if it held the answers to some unspoken question. Emily's heart ached at the sight. There was a rawness to the woman's demeanor, a vulnerability that stirred something deep within her. She knew that kind of pain, the kind that left you paralyzed, unable to move forward but unsure how to stay still either. It was the same grief she had carried since James's death. For a moment, she considered walking past, leaving the young woman to her thoughts. But something stopped her. "Are you all right?" Emily's voice was soft, hesitant. The woman didn't look up right away. It was as if she hadn't heard the question at all. But after a few moments, she slowly raised her head, her eyes meeting Emily's with a look of surprise, as if she hadn't expected anyone to notice her at all. For a long moment, the two women just stared at each other, the silence between them thick with unspoken emotion. Finally, the young woman spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know." It wasn't the answer Emily had expected, but it was honest. She recognized that feeling, the uncertainty, the loss of direction. Without thinking, Emily sat down on the bench beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. "I lost someone," the young woman continued, her voice breaking slightly. "A long time ago. And I've been looking for him ever since." Emily didn't know what to say. She had approached out of kindness, but now found herself pulled into the woman's pain, her own heart aching in response. She thought of James, how she had never really looked for him after he died, at least, not in the way this woman seemed to be searching. She had let his memory engulf her, but she hadn't sought to understand more. In a way, this woman's grief mirrored her own, though she wasn't sure how or why. "I'm sorry," Emily finally said, her voice soft. It was all she could offer, an apology to a stranger, though she knew it could never mend what was broken. The young woman shook her head, wiping at her eyes with the sleeve of her jacket. "It's not your fault. I thought I'd find him by now. Or at least find out why he left." Emily's mind raced. Who was this man the woman was looking for? And what had led her to this moment, sitting in a park, alone and desperate? But before she could ask, the woman stood, shakily, as if her body was barely supporting the weight of her grief. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice filled with a kind of hollow gratitude. I'm sorry for bothering you." "You're not bothering me," Emily said quickly, rising to her feet as well. "If you need anything, even just to talk, I'm here." "I mean it." The woman smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you," she repeated, but Emily could sense the finality in her tone. She was leaving, and nothing Emily said would stop her. Without another word, the young woman turned and walked away, her figure disappearing down the path lined with trees. Emily watched her go, a strange sense of loss settling in her chest. She had no idea who the woman was or why her story had affected her so deeply, but something about the encounter lingered in her mind. For the rest of the day, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed something important. There was a connection there, a thread of grief that tied them together, even though they were strangers. As she went about her usual tasks, folding laundry, making dinner, reading the same paragraph in her book over and over without absorbing any of the words, the young woman's face kept flashing in her mind. Who was she? What had she lost? And why did her story resonate so deeply within Emily's heart? That night, as Emily lay in bed, the stillness of the house pressing down on her, she couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. She turned the conversation over in her mind, replaying the woman's words, her expression, the way she had clung to her pain like it was the only thing she had left. Emily had seen that look before, in her own reflection. It was the look of someone who had been searching for answers that might never come. For the first time in months, Emily didn't feel completely alone in her grief. There was a strange comfort in knowing that someone else out there understood what it was like to live with the constant ache of loss. But at the same time, the woman's sadness stirred something in Emily that she hadn't felt in a long time, a need to know more, to understand the full story. It was as if the encounter had awakened a part of her that had been dormant for too long, a part that was tired of simply existing in the aftermath of James's death. As she stared up at the ceiling, the darkness of the room wrapping around her like a shroud, Emily made a decision. She didn't know why, but she had to find out more about that woman. There was something there, something she needed to understand. And somehow, it felt tied to her own journey, her own unresolved grief. The next morning, Emily returned to the park. She sat by the fountain, just as the woman had, her eyes scanning the path, hoping for a glimpse of the stranger who had stirred something deep within her. But the park was empty, save for a few early morning joggers and an elderly couple walking their dog. Emily stayed for over an hour, but the woman never appeared. Days passed, and Emily couldn't stop thinking about her. Who was she? Where had she gone? And what was her story? Emily couldn't explain it, but the encounter had left a mark on her, a small crack in the wall of isolation she had built around herself since James's death. And though she didn't understand why, she felt that finding the answers to the young woman's questions might somehow lead her to the answers she had been avoiding in her own life. A few days after the encounter in the park, Emily found herself drawn to a place she had been avoiding for months, James's grave. It wasn't that she hadn't wanted to visit. The cemetery was quiet, peaceful even, and his grave was well kept, shaded by a large oak tree that cast dappled sunlight over the stone. But every time she thought of going, the weight of her grief seemed to hold her back, as if stepping into that space would make his absence too real, too final. But today, something was different. That young woman's face, her words, had stayed with Emily, haunting her thoughts. There was something unresolved in the encounter, and though Emily couldn't fully explain it, she felt a pull to go to the cemetery. It was as if visiting James's grave might offer her some clarity, some connection to the past that she had been missing. The walk to the cemetery was short, just a few blocks from her home, and as Emily stepped through the wrought iron gates, she felt the familiar heaviness settle over her. The air was still, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional distant bird call. As she made her way down the narrow gravel path, she thought of how different life had been when James was alive. His presence had always been steady, grounding her in a way that she hadn't fully appreciated until he was gone. When she reached his grave, she paused, her eyes scanning the headstone with its simple inscription, James Wallace, beloved husband. For a moment, she just stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, the familiar ache settling into her chest. She had no words to say. What could she say? The loss was as raw as ever, and the questions that had plagued her in the months following his death still lingered, unanswered. But then, something caught her attention, a figure standing just a few feet away, her back turned to the grave, her dark hair falling in loose waves down her shoulders. Emily's heart skipped a beat. It was her, the young woman from the park. Sophia. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. What was she doing here? How did she even know about James? A rush of confusion and unease swept over her, but she forced herself to step forward, her footsteps crunching softly on the gravel. The woman hadn't noticed her yet. She was staring down at the grave, a look of deep sorrow etched into her features. Sophia? Emily's voice was quiet but carried enough weight to make the woman turn. Sophia looked up, startled at first, and then her eyes softened with recognition. She seemed hesitant, as if unsure how to explain herself. Emily felt her stomach twist. What are you doing here? Her voice wavered slightly, betraying the mixture of emotions that surged through her, confusion, curiosity, and a growing sense of dread. Sophia swallowed hard, her gaze shifting from Emily to the grave and back again. I didn't expect to see you here, she said softly. There was something in her tone that made Emily feel uneasy, a nervousness that suggested there was more to this meeting than just a coincidence. I didn't expect to see you here either, Emily replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Why are you visiting my husband's graves? For a long moment, Sophia said nothing. She looked down at the gravestone, her fingers twisting nervously in the hem of her coat. Emily watched her closely, her mind racing with questions. The air between them felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that neither woman knew how to break. Finally, Sophia spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. I think James was my father. The words hung in the air like a sharp blade, cutting through the silence and slicing into Emily's heart. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet, and she was struggling to find her balance. What? The word escaped Emily's lips before she could fully comprehend what she had just heard. That's not possible. Sophia looked up at her, her eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored Emily's own. I don't know for sure, but my mother told me his name. She said he was the man she was with before she met my stepfather. I've been trying to find him for years, following what little information I had. And it led me here. Emily shook her head, her mind reeling. No. James never mentioned anything like that. He would have told me if. But even as the words left her mouth, doubt crept in. James had always been private, even with her. There had been parts of his life he kept closed off, things he never discussed. Could it be possible? Could he have had a child he never told her about? The thought made her stomach churn. Sophia looked down, her face a mask of sorrow and uncertainty. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. I've been searching for so long, and when I found out he had passed, I didn't know what else to do. I thought maybe I could at least understand why he never wanted me in his life. The pain in her voice was palpable, and Emily's heart softened despite the shock that still rippled through her. She wanted to deny it, to tell Sophia that she was wrong, that there had been a mistake. But deep down, a small part of her wondered if this was the truth she had been missing all along. The truth about James, about the parts of his life he had kept hidden from her. "I don't know what to say," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "This doesn't make any sense." Sophia nodded, her expression one of quiet resignation. "I know. I don't expect you to believe me right away. But I had to come. I had to see where he was." Emily stared at the grave, her mind swirling with 1,000 questions. She thought of all the years she had spent with James, all the moments they had shared, the secrets they had kept from each other, some small, some larger than she had ever imagined. Could he have really kept something this monumental from her? And if so, why? "I'm sorry," Sophia said again, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "I didn't mean to intrude. I don't know where else to turn." Emily looked at her, her heart breaking for the young woman who stood before her, a stranger but also, perhaps, a piece of James's past that she had never known existed. She wanted to be angry, to lash out, to deny the possibility of this revelation. But all she felt was a deep, hollow ache, the kind that came from realizing you might never have truly known the person you loved the most. "I need some time," Emily finally said, her voice barely audible. "I need to think." Sophia nodded, her face filled with understanding. "Of course. I didn't mean to overwhelm you." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind rustled through the leaves, and the quiet of the cemetery seemed to press down on them both, as if the weight of the secrets buried here were too much to bear. Emily felt numb, her mind still trying to process what had just happened. She looked at Sophia once more, seeing in her eyes a reflection of the same grief, the same search for answers that had plagued her for so long. "Take care," Sophia whispered before turning and walking away, her footsteps echoing softly on the gravel path. Emily watched her go, her heart heavy with confusion, grief, and a strange sense of connection. She stood there for a long time, staring at the grave, her thoughts racing. Could it really be true? Had James kept the secret from her for all those years? And if so, what else had he hidden? The questions swirled in her mind, and for the first time in months, she felt a deep, unsettling compulsion to seek out the answers. She had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. In the days following her encounter with Sophia at the cemetery, Emily was consumed by a whirlwind of emotions. The shock of what Sophia had said clung to her like a heavy fog, refusing to lift. She replayed the conversation over and over in her mind, each time trying to find some explanation, some way to make sense of it all. But no matter how hard she tried, she kept coming back to the same question. Had James really been Sophia's father? And if so, why had he never told her? Grief had always been a steady companion in the 2 years since James's death, but now it was mixed with something darker, betrayal. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she had been deceived, that the life she had shared with James had been built on secrets she never knew existed. The memories of their marriage, once a source of comfort, now felt tainted. Every loving gesture, every tender moment, seemed overshadowed by the possibility that there had been a part of him she never truly knew. Anger surged through her at odd moments, catching her off guard. She would be folding laundry or washing dishes, and suddenly, she'd slam her hands down on the counter, a growl of frustration escaping her lips. How could he have kept something like this from her? What else had he hidden? The questions gnawed at her, making it impossible to find any peace. And yet, beneath the anger, there was something else, an ache of sorrow that ran even deeper than her grief. She had always thought she knew James inside and out, that they had shared everything. They had spent 20 years together, building a life, sharing their hopes and dreams. But now, it seemed, there had been a whole other part of his life, one that he had kept locked away. Emily had never imagined that he could be capable of such a betrayal. It wasn't just the fact that he might have had a child with another woman that hurt her so deeply. It was the fact that he had never told her. In their years together, James had always been her rock, the one person she could rely on. And now, in his absence, she was left wondering if she had ever truly known him at all. Emily's house, once a place of refuge, now felt like a prison. Every room seemed to hold memories of James, his scent lingering in the hallway, his favorite books stacked neatly on the shelf, the faint sound of his laughter echoing in her mind. But those memories, once cherished, now felt like a cruel reminder of how much she had lost, not just in his death, but in the realization that their life together had been built on a foundation of secrets. For days, Emily avoided going into James's office. It was a room she had kept untouched since his passing, a place that still felt sacred in a way. But now, the door to that room seemed to beckon her, as if the answers she sought were hidden somewhere inside. She tried to resist, telling herself that it was better to leave the past alone. But the need to know the truth grew stronger with each passing hour, until finally, she couldn't ignore it any longer. One afternoon, with trembling hands, Emily stood in front of the office door. She stared at the polished wood, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she considered turning away, leaving the room as it was, untouched by the grief and confusion that now consumed her. But something inside her, perhaps the same force that had driven her to the cemetery, pushed her forward. She opened the door slowly, as if she were afraid of what she might find on the other side. The room smelled faintly of old leather and paper, just as it always had. Everything was exactly as James had left it, his desk neat and organized, books lining the shelves, a few framed photographs scattered here and there. It was as if time had stopped in this room, as if James might walk through the door at any moment, his easy smile lighting up the space. Emily's eyes scanned the room, her gaze falling on the small wooden desk tucked into the corner. That desk had always been James's sanctuary, the place where he would retreat after long days, writing in his journal or working on projects he never spoke much about. She had never intruded on his space, respecting his need for privacy, but now, standing in the doorway, she couldn't help but wonder what secrets that desk held. With a deep breath, Emily crossed the room and sat down at the desk. Her fingers traced the smooth surface of the wood, her mind racing with questions. Was there something here, some clue, some piece of his past that would explain everything? Or was she chasing a ghost, searching for answers that didn't exist? She opened the first drawer slowly, half expecting to find nothing but the usual: pens, notebooks, the occasional stray paperclip. But then, tucked away in the back of the drawer, something caught her eye. It was an old, leather-bound journal, worn with age, the edges frayed as if it had been handled many times. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She pulled the journal out carefully, her hands shaking as she placed it on the desk in front of her. She recognized it immediately. It was James's diary, the one he had kept for years. He had always been a private man, never sharing much about what he wrote in those pages, and Emily had never asked. But now, as she stared at the worn cover, she knew that whatever secrets he had kept were hidden in those pages. For a long moment, Emily just stared at the journal, her mind racing with possibilities. Did she really want to know what was inside? Would it bring her the answers she so desperately sought, or would it only deepen the wound that was already tearing her apart? With a deep breath, she opened the journal. The pages were filled with James's familiar handwriting, neat and precise, just as he had always been. The first few entries were ordinary, detailing his daily life, his thoughts on work, and small anecdotes about their life together. But as Emily flipped through the pages, the tone began to shift. There were entries she didn't recognize, moments from his past that he had never shared with her. And then, finally, she found it, an entry that made her heart stop. June 5th, 2001. Sophia. I've thought of her so many times over the years. I wonder where she is now, what kind of woman she's become. I regret not being there for her, not being the father she deserved. But what could I have done? Emily wouldn't understand. She could never know. I've made my choice, and I have to live with it. But some nights, the guilt eats at me. I wonder if she hates me. I wonder if she even remembers me. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she read the words. Her hands trembled, the journal slipping slightly in her grasp. She had never known. James had never said a word about this woman, Sophia's mother, or the child they had together. It was all there, hidden in the pages of his journal, a secret life that he had kept from her for all those years. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she continued reading, each word cutting deeper than the last. James had loved Sophia, in his own way. He had wanted to be part of her life, but had chosen not to out of fear. Fear of losing Emily, fear of the judgment that would come with revealing his past. The guilt had haunted him, but he had kept it hidden, locked away in the pages of this journal. Emily closed the diary, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had just learned. She had wanted answers, and now she had them. But they weren't the answers she had expected. James had been a man of secrets, and those secrets had shaped their life in ways she had never imagined. The betrayal, the pain, the regret, it all washed over her in waves, leaving her feeling adrift once again. For a long time, Emily sat in the quiet of the office, the journal resting in her lap. She had spent so much time grieving for the man she thought she knew, but now, in the aftermath of this discovery, she wasn't sure who she was grieving for anymore. The man she had loved, or the man he had hidden from her. The next few days passed in a haze for Emily. The journal, now resting on the desk in James's office, had become a source of both clarity and unbearable confusion. She had wanted to know the truth, and now she had it, but it had come with a price. Each entry she read revealed more about James's internal struggle, his love for her, his regret, his fear of losing the life they had built together if she ever discovered his past. But more than that, it had made her realize that Sophia, too, had been a victim of this silence, left to wander through life searching for a man who was never truly there for her. Emily couldn't ignore it any longer. The discovery of Sophia's existence had shaken her to the core, but it had also opened her eyes to something she had been avoiding for a long time, her own need for connection. James was gone, and the life they had shared was now a closed chapter. But there was someone still living, still searching for answers, just as Emily had been. And despite the complexity of her emotions, Emily knew she couldn't let Sophia suffer in the same silence. The decision to reach out to Sophia wasn't easy. The hurt was still fresh, the wound of betrayal still raw. But as she sat in James's office, the weight of the past heavy on her shoulders, she realized that holding on to the anger and grief wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't bring James back, and it wouldn't heal the pain that both she and Sophia were feeling. Emily found Sophia's number on the small piece of paper the young woman had left with her the day they met at the cemetery. She stared at it for what felt like hours, debating whether to call. What would she say? How could she begin to untangle the mess of emotions that had been stirred up since that fateful day at James's grave? But something inside her, perhaps a sense of duty or a need for closure, urged her to pick up the phone. The call rang once, twice, then Sophia's voice came through, soft and tentative. "Hello." Emily hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. "Sophia? It's Emily." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Emily worried that Sophia might not want to hear from her. But then, Sophia's voice returned, cautious but open. "Emily, I didn't think I'd hear from you." Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight with the weight of what she needed to say. "I wasn't sure if I should call," she admitted. "But I've been thinking about what you told me, about James and about you." Sophia was quiet, giving her space to continue. "I found something," Emily said softly, her gaze drifting toward the closed office door as if James might still be on the other side, working at his desk. "James kept a diary. I didn't know about it until recently, but I found it. He wrote about you, Sophia. He wrote about how much he regretted not being in your life." On the other end of the line, Sophia let out a soft gasp, a mixture of surprise and sadness. "He did." Emily nodded, even though Sophia couldn't see her. "He did. He struggled with it, with the guilt. He was afraid to tell me, afraid of what it might do to our marriage. I think he didn't know how to make things right, so he kept it all hidden. But that doesn't mean he didn't care. He wrote about you often." There was a long pause, and when Sophia spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. I didn't know if he even remembered me." "He did," Emily said softly. "He remembered you. And I think in his own way, he loved you. But he was scared. I don't think that excuses what he did, or the way he kept you out of his life, but I wanted you to know that he thought about you." Another pause, and Emily could hear the quiet sound of Sophia trying to hold back her tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for telling me that." Emily felt her own eyes welling up with tears. It wasn't easy sharing this with Sophia, but it felt like the right thing to do. There was still so much pain, so much left unresolved, but in that moment, Emily realized that they were both victims of James's silence. And perhaps, in sharing their grief, they could begin to heal. "I don't know what comes next," Emily admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "This is all so overwhelming. But I want to try. I want to understand more. And I want to help if I can." Sophia's voice was soft, but there was a warmth in it now, a flicker of hope. "I'd like that. I'd like to get to know you, too. I think we both have a lot to figure out." Emily smiled, though it was bittersweet. "Yes, we do. But maybe we can figure it out together." The conversation ended soon after, but for the first time in what felt like years, Emily felt a sense of relief. It wasn't closure, not yet. There were still too many emotions to process, too many unanswered questions. But reaching out to Sophia had been a step forward, a small, tentative step, but a step nonetheless. In the days that followed, Emily and Sophia spoke more often. Their conversations were careful, slow, as they each navigated the complicated emotions that had been stirred by James's death and the revelations that followed. They spoke about James, about the man they had both known, but from different perspectives. Sophia shared the little she remembered of her brief encounters with him, while Emily shared stories of their life together, the good and the bad. In doing so, they began to build a bridge between their separate lives, one that was tentative but growing stronger with each passing day. Eventually, Emily invited Sophia to her home. It wasn't an easy decision. Her house had been a place filled with memories of James, and the idea of bringing someone connected to his secret past into that space felt daunting. But Emily knew it was necessary if she truly wanted to move forward, to begin the process of healing. When Sophia arrived, Emily could see the nervousness in her eyes. She felt it too, a strange mix of apprehension and anticipation. But they greeted each other with a tentative smile, the first step toward something new. Over tea, they talked again, this time in person, with the warmth of shared space making the conversation feel more intimate, more real. Emily showed Sophia around the house, pointing out the small details of her life with James, from the books he had loved to the little quirks of his personality that only someone who had lived with him would know. In return, Sophia shared more of her own story, her life with her mother, the years spent wondering about the man who had been absent, and the complicated feelings she now had after learning the truth. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the conversation grew tense, the weight of their shared pain too much to bear. But there were also moments of understanding, of empathy, where they both realized that they were not so different after all. Both had loved James, and both had been hurt by his choices. But now they had the chance to build something new, something not defined by the past, but by the present. As the evening drew to a close, Emily found herself feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was fragile, like a tiny flame flickering in the dark, but it was there. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't shaped solely by grief and loss, but by the possibility of connection, of reconciliation. When Sophia left that evening, they hugged, tentative but genuine. Emily watched her walk down the front steps and disappear into the night, her heart lighter than it had been in years. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There were still scars, still unanswered questions. But there was also the beginning of something new, something that felt like healing. In the weeks that followed, Emily and Sophia continued to build a relationship, one step at a time. It was not always easy, but there was a mutual understanding between them, a shared recognition of the pain and loss they had both endured. Slowly, Emily found herself stepping into a new role, one that she hadn't anticipated, a role that blended mentorship, friendship, and something resembling a maternal bond. Sophia, for her part, seemed to welcome this connection. Having spent so many years searching for answers about her father, she had never imagined that what she would find was not just the truth about him, but a potential relationship with someone who had loved him just as much as she had longed to. There were still moments of tension, moments when the complexity of their connection threatened to overwhelm them, but each time, they found their way back to one another. For Emily, this new bond with Sophia brought a strange sense of purpose. Her days, once filled with the empty routine of simply existing, now had a new rhythm. She found herself looking forward to their conversations, their shared stories, and even their silences, which no longer felt as oppressive as they once had. There was a healing power in those moments, an unspoken agreement that they were both trying to move forward, even though the path was still uncertain. Gradually, Emily began to step out of the shadow of James's memory. She still missed him. Of course, there were days when the grief washed over her in waves, leaving her breathless and aching. But the bitterness, the anger that had consumed her after discovering his secret, began to fade. She understood now that James had been a man filled with flaws and fears, just like anyone else. He had made choices, some good, some bad, but in the end, he had loved her. And he had loved Sophia, too, in his own way. One bright, crisp morning, Emily found herself back at the cemetery, standing once again in front of James's grave. But this time, the weight of grief didn't crush her as it once had. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of acceptance. The wind stirred the leaves around her feet, and the sun filtered through the branches of the oak tree, casting a soft, golden light over the headstone. She knelt down, brushing her fingers lightly across the inscription. Beloved husband, it was still true, despite everything. She would always love James, but she was learning that love didn't have to be static. It could change, evolve, and still hold meaning. She had spent so much time mourning the life they had shared, the secrets that had come between them, but now she understood that life was messy, filled with complexities and contradictions. And that was okay. Emily smiled softly to herself, her mind drifting to Sophia. She thought about how far they had come, about the tentative trust they had built together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in years, Emily felt a sense of peace, a peace that came from knowing she wasn't alone anymore. She had found someone who understood, who had been touched by the same man and who, like her, was trying to make sense of it all. As she stood, her eyes lingered on the grave one last time. "Goodbye, James," she whispered, her voice carried away on the breeze. It wasn't a final goodbye, not really, he would always be a part of her. But it was a farewell to the part of her that had been trapped in grief, in the pain of his absence and the betrayal she had felt. She was ready to move forward, to let go of the anger and regret that had weighed her down for so long. As Emily turned to leave, she heard footsteps behind her. She glanced over her shoulder and saw Sophia walking up the path toward her, her expression soft but filled with a quiet strength. They exchanged a brief, knowing look, and Sophia came to stand beside her, offering a gentle smile. "I thought I'd find you here," Sophia said, her voice warm but respectful of the moment. Emily nodded, feeling the warmth of Sophia's presence beside her. "I wanted to say goodbye." Sophia's gaze fell on the grave, and for a moment, they both stood in silence, united in their shared loss but also in the new beginning they were creating together. It was a strange, bittersweet moment, saying goodbye to the man who had connected them while also embracing the future they were building in his absence. After a few moments, Emily turned to Sophia, her smile growing a little wider. "Shall we take a walk?" Sophia nodded, and together, they began to walk through the cemetery, the quiet peace of the morning settling over them like a comforting blanket. The path wound through the park, leading them away from the grave and into the sunlit distance, where the trees swayed gently in the breeze. As they walked, Emily felt a sense of lightness she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't that the pain was gone. She knew it never fully would be, but it had changed, softened. It no longer defined her. She wasn't just the widow left behind by James. She was a woman stepping into a new chapter of her life, one where healing was possible, where connections could be forged from even the most painful of circumstances. And with each step, she felt a little more certain of the future. The path ahead was still unclear, but for the first time, She wasn't afraid of it. She had Sophia by her side, and together, they were building something new, something rooted not in the secrets of the past, but in the hope of what was yet to come. As they reached the edge of the park, Emily glanced at Sophia, feeling a quiet gratitude for the woman who had walked into her life so unexpectedly. Their bond, forged in the fire of grief and revelation, was still fragile, but it was growing stronger with each passing day. And in that bond, Emily found the courage to believe in the possibility of new beginnings. The sunlight bathed the path ahead of them in a golden glow, and for the first time, in what felt like an eternity, Emily allowed herself to hope. Hope for the future, for the woman she was becoming, and for the connection she was building with Sophia. Together, they would face whatever came next, two women bound by love, loss, and the promise of something more. As they walked toward the horizon, the park around them alive with a quiet hum of life, Emily smiled to herself. This was her new beginning, and it was filled with hope.